Warning, this episode discusses topics related to substance abuse, addiction, suicidal ideations, and recovery. The content may contain graphic descriptions of drug or alcohol use, as well as references to mental health issues and trauma. If you are currently struggling with addiction or in recovery, please be aware that the discussion may be triggering. We encourage you to seek support from a licensed professional or a trusted support system if needed. Viewer and listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. In today's episode, I chat with Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands. Dr. Kimani is a licensed clinical psychologist with more than 15 years of experience providing mental health and consultation services in community-based agencies as well as schools. Now, she's facilitated in the areas of mental health awareness, cultural context and trauma, psychological first aid, crisis response, suicide prevention and intervention, threat response and management, and staff wellness. She's also the author of Butterfly Landing. Let's go check out her story. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands. Dr. Kimani is also the founder of Lifting as We Climb Consulting, where she provides trainings and consultations focused on supporting emotional wellness. Now, these sessions are strength-based, culturally grounded, and trauma-informed. Now, in addition to her work as a licensed clinical psychologist in the mental health field, she also left her job during the pandemic. So I'm really excited to hear more about her journey as well as her practice. So hi, Dr. Kimani. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here today.
Absolutely. Now, I'm excited to have you on the show, right? Because look, during this Mental Health Awareness Month, these topics are really important for people to be aware of. And so anything that we can do and that I can do in this platform and you on your platform to really heighten that awareness, I'm just really appreciative of you coming on. And so now prior to us kind of getting into, obviously you leaving your job during the pandemic, but also your practice, tell us a little bit about, your upbringing and where you call home.
Okay. So I am from Chicago, grew up in a suburb of Chicago called Oak Park. Oak Park was known as a very diverse, liberal suburb. However, many of us experience that, there's like a tale of two cities. So sometimes an area purports something, but our experience is very different. So just think about post George Floyd and his murder and the performative diversity. So that was my experience in Oak Park, right? Oak Park River Forest High School was my alma mater. So there's actually a documentary that talks about that in terms of the tale of two cities for Black youth at that school. So as I was growing up, just saw a lot of different things that didn't quite make sense to me, looking around in terms of why certain people were treated certain ways and other people weren't. Or, even in high school, having experiencing racism at a very young age. And thank goodness my parents had conversations with me, throughout my life, and throughout my childhood about being a Black child and how I had to work twice as hard to get half as much. And so I was prepared for those types of interactions. But even starting like in elementary school, I remember when I came to Oak Park, we moved from Chicago, and you had to take a placement exam. And I placed in an honors, the highest level for reading. And as I was coming into my class, again, elementary school, the teacher met me at the door and said, "What are you doing here?" And I, was a little thrown off, but remembering my upbringing, I said, well, I tested into this class. And when I came into the class, the assigned reading was Huckleberry Finn. And to this day, I despise that book because it was only me and another young Black boy in the class. And if you know Huckleberry Finn, almost every other word is the N-word. And we were in the class and the teacher, the other kids in the class were very anxious when they came across that word because we had to read out loud And the teacher, who was a white woman, would loudly scream to them, read it, read it, read it. And I know each time they read that word, I was mortified, right? And so I think those experiences really helped shape my perspective in terms of ways that race and racism permeates all of our systems at a very young age. And again, I did have my family in terms of really helping to prepare me for things like that. But I think what we see, and what I've seen, and what I've always been curious about, and I think what kind of led me to the field of psychology, is ways that what's going on in the world around us, ways that impacts how we see ourselves and how we see the world and how we interact. And so I was always very curious. I loved to read as a child. I would look around me and see certain things that didn't quite make sense, or I would see certain behaviors that didn't quite make sense, and just that fascination about human behavior, and also trying to figure out why is it that certain people who have certain conditions go one way and other people might go in another direction, right? So in terms of looking at not only those factors that contribute to our well-being, but also what are those factors that protect us in terms of going in one direction or the next. So that's just a general, in terms of my upbringing. But from my experience in high school, I was very determined to have a very different experience in college. So I went to Spelman College. I love my alma mater. And Spelman really provided me with an opportunity to really see other brilliant Black women and be supported and nurtured, and be supported and always to speak my truth and to not be silenced. And that trend has followed me from childhood all the way up to now. And also when we think about like that armoring that we experience many times as Black people, we might get that from our family. I also got that from Spelman. So in terms of being affirmed and valued and seen, and really tasked with building upon what our ancestors have developed for us. And so that has been my motivation moving forward too, is not only for sisterhood, but for Black people. What am I doing to support our healing and our growth? Because so many people have died and sacrificed for us to be here.
No, absolutely. And now, prior to launching your own practice, tell us a little bit about your work journey and really what's worked well in the environments in which you've shown up.
Fascinating question, Brian. I feel like I could write a book about this, actually. It has definitely been a journey in becoming a psychologist. I think that this is a situation for many Black people in certain fields, is that you work really hard, right, in terms of academically, and you do all the things that you are told to do. However, there are situations that we run into in terms of a lot of adversities based upon like issues of race, sex, right, our backgrounds. And so there's additional things that we have to fight as we are becoming, into these roles. And I think the challenge is that many times we get our degrees, we get licensed. It is not easy, right? So we do all of these things, and there's an expectation or hope that we'll be able to do our jobs, right? That we come in and we're very qualified, but we encounter a lot of adversity in the workplace. And that we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of why I left. But the journey to become a psychologist was not easy at all. And I just want to share just briefly, my first graduate school journey. So I left Spelman College, very affirmed, right? Feeling very confident. And I went to graduate school in a clinical psychology PhD program in the South. I won't identify what the name of the institution was, but a lot of racism there. It was a few Black people in one class, and the professor pulled us aside and said, I want to meet with you guys after class. We meet with the professor, and he says, and the professor's not Black, and he says, most people fail this class. Most Black people fail this class. So I'm going to make it mandatory for you guys to come in for a once a week tutorial session with me. And it was three Black women, and we're young, we don't know what's going on here. And we sought support from other faculty. We go to the faculty. We knew something was wrong, but we didn't know what quite to do. So we go to other faculty, and the other faculty wasn't helpful. They would say things like, oh, he's just trying to be helpful. Oh, he's just joking, right? but it definitely was not a joke. We would go in and it was like an oral exam every time we went in. And so we ended up filing a racial complaint. And it was horrible. It was a horrible experience. And from that and other things that happened there, I decided this is not the place for me, right? I knew that I was not thriving. It's no way I could become a psychologist if I was harmed, right? And so I had to take a pause, leave, and apply all over again. I had to start my whole graduate school experience all over again. But from that experience, I was very intentional in terms of where I chose to go from there. I chose to be at a place where I knew they valued culture. I knew that there was an understanding of ways that social historical issues impact our functioning. And I had a very different experience when I went to graduate school the next time. I met my mentor there, Dr. Shelley Harrell, still connected with her, and she became my dissertation chair as well.
No, that's awesome. So what's interesting about that, right, is that because look, being in the psychology field has become your life's work, right? Mm-hmm. And this initial experience didn't dissuade you from being in the field, right? No. Maybe that wasn't the right setting for you to be in, but the field was important. So yes. What was it, or what is it about the field of psychology that really led you to making this your life work?
Yeah, I think a lot of different things. I think that deep commitment to seeing Black people and what we've gone through, and really trying to figure out how can I be part of our healing. And when I think about all the movement that we've had in terms of our ancestors, how can I continue that trend forward? But recognizing that as Black people, that we have gone through so much harm and we continue to go through so much harm. And so I have felt that that's my mission, is to do that, is to really help support healing. And I also have been very transparent about my own healing journey, about a lot of different things in my life, right? Because I feel that by testimony, and we know that testimony is a cultural form of healing. So by testimony and sharing my own healing journey, I want to show other people that you can heal also, that becoming healed is not like an end game, right? It's a process. And so being determined to do that, and I think that the adversities that I've experienced, in terms of becoming a psychologist, and even once I became a psychologist, that has made me even more determined, right? So there's a little slogan that I say to myself that I feel like it's my motto: can't stop, won't stop. There's nothing's going to stop me, right? So if anything, I'm going to be more determined to do what I feel like I am meant to do, right? And it doesn't matter who might question me or who might make me feel that I'm not welcomed. I've learned to kind of pivot around people, but I've also learned to advocate and use my voice. So I've refused to be silenced. And even knowing that it doesn't matter what degree I have, that I might be treated in certain ways. I remember I went to a conference that was an African-American mental health conference. And when I was at the conference, I was going to sign up to get my continuing education credits. And I was going to sign in, and the person there was not a Black person, but again, African-American mental health conference. And the person asked me 3 different times if I was a psychologist. And there was a level of disbelief that I could be a psychologist. And I just kept, right? And so I just want to say this to anyone who's listening, that if you are in a profession, people may still question you and challenge you, but you just have to keep going. Okay. And recognize that this may happen. And I wish that I was prepared for it. I was kind of thrown off when that happened. And then at the end of the conference, when I go back to turn in my continuing education evaluations, someone else who was not Black did the same thing to me again 3 times, asked me if I was a psychologist, right? But it wasn't just the asking, it was this: you cannot really be one. Right. So it was that sense that either you're lying, you can't read, or there's something going on here. Right. So again, being very transparent about my own journey.
No, definitely. Now, what I'd love to do is, look, I don't have a show without the pandemic. Right. And so what I'd like to do is take you back to March of 2020, where we're really introduced to what we now know as the pandemic. And so talk a little bit about how the pandemic affected you and some of the things that you learned during this time.
Yeah, well, I think that was a very terrifying time for all of us in terms of what does this mean. And I think that many people during the pandemic really took a step back at their lives and thought, is this the life that I want to live? Right? Have I accomplished everything? Is this the life going forward? Is this the life? And I said, no, absolutely not. This is not the life that I want. I felt personally there were things that was going well for me. However, professionally, I felt that I wasn't growing, that there were certain things within my work environment that were very toxic and harmful to me physically and psychologically. And it really provided me an opportunity, not being there, to really take a step back and say, okay, this is definitely not the life for me, right? This is not why I became a psychologist. So what do I need to do, or what changes do I need to put in place for me to create the life that I want? And that is aligned with why I even became a psychologist in the first place. Because there were things that were happening in the workplace that were not only harmful for me in the sense of really questioning myself, but also just some physical issues that I was having. My hair first started falling out. I was having these profuse nosebleeds, never had nosebleeds before in my life. And right around the time that all this stuff was happening, it was like, it kind of was brewing, right? So I would say even before the pandemic, a lot of the stuff I was going through was kind of brewing. But I think a lot of people kind of just like, well, we could just take it, or we'll fight through it, right? And I was in the same boat. But when 2020 happened and all these things were happening, it was really a moment of me taking a moment to reflect on, is this the life that I want for myself? And it wasn't. It wasn't. So I knew that I needed to make some changes.
No, definitely. And as I mentioned earlier, you were in the school system at this time. And so, look, I had I have two young kids. And so I remember what it was like from a remote learning standpoint. And so for you, what was it like in the school system during this time with remote learning and the shutdowns, all those things?
Well, because I was a therapist, during that time for the school system, it was very difficult to try to connect to kids, because it was hard to reach them by phone. It was hard to have sessions, and it just felt very it was a lot of barriers to us continuing services. And, for a time period, I really thought about my practice, and I thought about, why I came into the field, and even why I worked for the school district. And I wasn't able to do the work that I wanted to do in the school district in terms of really contributing to true transformative change. And I was very limited in a lot of ways because of the toxicity going on in the work environment. And from that point, when I realized I'm not even able to do the work that I want to do to really help heal people, that's when I started thinking about what are my other options. And at that point, I got a business coach to help me pivot in terms of providing mental health services, therapy services, telehealth during the pandemic for Black people. Because I know, and there's a saying that, when something goes wrong in America, when America catches a cold, Black people catch pneumonia, right? And I knew that during the pandemic that Black people were particularly hurting. And so I started seeing clients in my private practice, like after work. I would start seeing clients after work. And that just grew, and that allowed me to pivot to a different direction and eventually leave that job.
Oh, definitely. And so, so obviously the pandemic is affecting your relationship, with your job and how things are going. But looking back, what is one thing that you think you would have done differently during the pandemic?
That's hard. One thing I think I would have done differently is I think that I would have left the job sooner. I think that I spent a lot of time trying to fight the job, in terms of fight for my right to speak up, to fight for services for Black students and staff and families. I think that I spent a lot of time trying to fight and trying to make a way that it was a no way, right? So sometimes when we're in systems, the whole system is toxic, right? So I spent a lot of time focusing on certain individuals and trying to get clarity and trying to meet and trying to do all these things, but it was futile, right? Because the system was not invested in changing and the system colluded with one another. So I was coming from one perspective. So I definitely would have left much sooner. I think that would have really spared me a lot of pain in terms of leaving sooner. And I think that I would have been able to do more work in terms of really healing, doing the healing work that I want to do.
Oh, definitely. It's actually a perfect transition. So now, you're in this last school district, right?
Mm-hmm.
Second largest in the nation for
Yes.
almost 15 years, right?
Yes.
So you were there for some time.
Yes.
And now you decide to leave in July of 2022.
Yes.
So ultimately, why did you leave your job during the pandemic?
Oh, there's so many things, Brian. I'm just going to give some highlights. Okay. There's so many different things. And, for myself, I was trying to, again, stay there because I was committed to the work and committed. When you work with children, it's just a whole different level, right? So committed. And I tried to make things work. I tried everything. I tried all that I knew to make things better, and nothing was better. And it was things that happened in terms of just feeling silenced, feeling disrespected, being yelled at, asked to go to meetings, but not allowed to even introduce myself, being told I have to be silent the whole meeting. People in leadership positions. Now, I've always had outstanding evaluations, right? Been placed in leadership positions, but my name being maligned, in front of other people, even though my work in terms of evaluation wasn't, but being maligned in public, in terms of certain things, being told when I'm trying to get clarity about a situation that I have black and white thinking, right? When I'm just trying to figure out, well, what is it that you want me to do, right? Being told that when I'm trying to ask about specifically about Black students in terms of what types of supports are for Black students, because I noticed that they were not getting the type of support needed, being shut down and told, well, we're for all children, with the implication that I'm not for all children, right? That I am, but just being shut down. And I think that, things just became more and more ridiculous, right? So I will give like two more pinnacle moments, right? So like I said, I have pages of documentation of different things that happened. But one was I, was very vocal in terms of speaking out against the system, and very vocal in terms of where I felt were some shortfalls, right? But I also was very proactive in trying to fill in the gaps, right? So one of the trainings that I co-developed at the district was cultural context and trauma, because I recognize that trauma does not happen in a vacuum. Our functioning is not within a vacuum, right? So we have to look at our culture and what's contributing to our functioning. So co-developed this training, very well received throughout the district, right? But the department that I was a part of never supported the training. Other parts in the district supported it, right? And I was told that the reason why the training was not supported was because I presented it, that it was my training. Even though that was my vision, even though I worked and co-developed the training with someone else, but it was like a punishment, right? So because the system couldn't take ownership of it, then they were going to just shut it down, right? And then I was also demoted, during that time, right? And so I was told that my position was no longer a full-time position, even though I was doing full-time work, right? And I was doing up and above what I was supposed to be doing. So I was doing extra things. I was co-creating things. I was creating trainings. But I was told that my position was going to be cut and I was going to be demoted back to my entry-level position. So keep in mind, I was already put in leadership positions. I was training other people. So I was being demoted to the position I was brought into. So those people who I trained would be over me now, right? And those things that I like to do, in terms of meeting with Black students, meeting with the Black student unions, doing trainings, I was told I would not be able to do any of that, right? And at that point, it became, what are you doing here? You're not growing at all. You're going back to your entry-level position and you're being silenced, right? I had a supervisor go through my entire calendar, Brian, and give me an inquisition about everything on my calendar. And I felt, wow, I worked too hard to get to this point. I cannot tolerate this, right? Okay, there were actually two more. Okay, so one more thing was, I went to a training, and the training was for clinicians, and it was only me and another Black woman at the training. So the trainer is a therapist and was so excited about sharing about this intervention that his dad did. And he wanted to show us this video about his dad doing this intervention with a client. So the client was a young Black boy, maybe a teenager, and the therapist was not a Black person. And the therapist, and so the trainer says, okay, this is a paradoxical intervention. I want you guys to watch this paradoxical intervention, and then we're going to come back together and talk about it. So during the video, the therapist says to the Black boy, why are you so dumb? How did you become so stupid? How'd that happen? Right? And I'm sitting there mortified, right? Then he brings in the young man's mother, and he says to the mother, how did you raise such a dumb child? He is so stupid. You know, he's going to end up in juvenile detention. And you know what happens to kids in juvenile detention, right? They get raped, right? You know what's going to happen. And I'm sitting there dying inside. And as I'm sitting there, the other Black woman in the room is texting me. And she's saying, oh my God, I'm so triggered right now. And I said, I am too. And I'm going to say something. So again, going back to my childhood, right? I've been very vocal about things. So when he stops the video, he says, so what'd you guys think? Now he's proud of it because that's his dad, right? And I said, I found that video to be very offensive. I was triggered. I think other people were triggered in the room as well. And I think it was very challenging and very harmful to say these things to a young Black man, you know, given the society that we live in. And the trainer got very upset with me. And he got very defensive, and he said, you're not focusing on the intervention. I told you to focus on the intervention. Culture has nothing to do with it. And I said, no, culture has everything to do with it. And we live in a racist society, and racism permeates all of our systems. So then he doubles down and he says, well, I consulted with a Black man from the South, and he was okay with this intervention. And so I said, okay, well, you know, not all Black people are the same. And maybe this person was struggling with internalized racism. I don't know. But I'm not going to go back and forth with you. I just wanted to verbalize this to you, right? Now, keep in mind, Brian, nobody else in that room stepped in. Nobody in that room said anything else, right? Not even another Black woman. So shortly thereafter, we go on break. We're out at break, and people are coming up to me. Oh, thank you for saying that. Thank you so much for saying that. Right? But the fact that nobody said anything in that moment. And then when I go back and tell the people at the job who had organized this, what had happened, nothing happened either. Right? So what
you were
was the message?
Kind of like on an island.
Right. So what was the message conveyed? Right? So you could say Black Lives Matter, but you're allowing that to happen. Right? You're saying Black Lives Matter, but you know Black people within that area were harmed. Doesn't quite make sense, right? So when I saw all these things in 2020, that performative diversity, like we care about Black people, but then you treat Black staff horribly, like that, it doesn't. I can't co-sign with that. But the last sign absolutely was, you know, there were so many things that were happening, and I just was not. I could tell I was being harmed. So I took a break. I took a leave, right? I took a leave for a year. And as I took that leave, you know, my family was very supportive. My youngest son asked me if I was going back to that job. And I said, I don't know. I'm trying to figure things out. And he begged me not to go. He said, Mom, please don't go back there. You're so unhappy, right? And then I was, you know, going to a doctor's office to get another doctor's note in terms of why I could be on leave. And I'm in the parking lot of the hospital, and I'm crying profusely, right? I'm crying and I'm just sobbing. And the inner child within me, the inner me, was saying, please do not make me go back there, right? And then the last sign was, and I'm saying this because I hope that people who are listening, you are paying attention to your signs, because there's signs around you that tell you it's time to go. Right. And I'm sharing this with you, so you can see that for me, what the signs were. OK, the last sign that kind of just sealed the deal for me was I was in the shower and I heard the voice of God say to me, if you go back to that job, it's a death sentence. That was it. right? I knew that I
that'll
knew I
do it.
wouldn't make it. And I knew that I had seen other Black people, particularly other Black women at their job who literally died, right? And I saw other Black women who were having strokes, heart attacks, right? And these were not older, much older women, right? They were like within my age category. So all these things were kind of wake up calls for me that the job wasn't worth dying for. And I knew that I could not survive there.
No, that makes sense. And now, one of the things I've seen you talk about through, some of your work is
Hmm.
around this grief process, right? And how
Yes,
it's more than just what we typically associate with grief. And so what I'd
yes.
love for you to explain to our listeners is explain that grief process of leaving a job.
Yes, yes, yes. So I'm glad you asked that question because many times when we think about grief and we think about a toxic job, we're like, how does that go together? But it does go together because when you think about, first of all, when you're in a toxic workplace, many times that's a form of trauma, right? So that involves a level of healing. And when you think about the grief process, the grief can be so many different things. So it can be you came into the job with a certain idea or certain dreams, right? Or certain visions in terms of what you may accomplish, what your goals might be, or what you wanted to do at the job. And now you have to say goodbye to that, right? Because you come to the realization that those things are not happening, or maybe they used to happen and now they're not happening anymore. It may also be the grief that there may have been certain people that you trusted or you thought you could trust at the job who betrayed you in some ways or that didn't have your back when you were having a difficult time. Or it may be situations in which you actually did have good relationships with coworkers at your job, and you're no longer going to be in that community with them anymore. Now, you may still have contact with them, but the relationship is different. So the grieving needs to happen so that you are able to go to the next environment without taking all that stuff with you. So I call it the drama and trauma with you. Okay. And when we think about but the grief, right? Just like when we lose a loved one, the grief is not linear. So you can go back and forth through the different stages, but it's important to be patient with yourself. I know that I still go back and forth through the anger stages, right? Or the different stages of grief. Just like when I talked to you before about what happened to me in my job, it brings up anger for me still, right? Now I'm on the other side in terms of I've been healing from it. But again, it's very important to go through that grief process so that we come to a better understanding of, this is why I feel this way, right? This is why once I left that job, I'm not like, oh my God, I'm so happy. It's not full joy. It comes with a lot of different emotions.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you mentioned that because even, when I heard you first mention that, I was like, oh, I guess I never really thought about grief in that way as
Yeah,
it pertains to a job. I think about grief with loss of a loved one or
right.
something like that, right? So I'm
Yes,
I'm, I'm glad that you kind of reframed that for me.
yes,
Um,
yes.
so now let's talk a little bit about some of the things that have happened since you left, right? And I mentioned it earlier. You have a practice, your YouTube channel, you're on the platforms, lifting as we climb consulting. So tell us more about that.
Yes, yes. Well, as I mentioned before, when I was at Spelman, just in terms of the importance for us to really connect to our community and really uplift our community as we're moving forward. And lifting as we climb was the motto or is the motto for the National Council of Negro Women. And I felt that word, that motto embodied so much of what I believed in, right? So sisterhood and also reaching back. So as I'm growing, how am I also supporting other people in terms of their healing journey? And so when I think about the work that I'm doing, like now I'm actually able to do the work that I want to do, right? So when I was at the toxic job, even thinking about the times, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the grief in here too, right? So even during that time, I really started to question if I wanted to still be a psychologist, which is really difficult, right? So for so many years, I knew I wanted to be a psychologist, right? So that drive. But when you are in a traumatic situation, you start questioning everything about your reality. So I was questioning, did I want to be a psychologist? What do I want to do? Right. But now that I've left, I have so much clarity in terms of these are the things that I want to do. And I'm so thankful that I'm a psychologist, right? Because I'm able to do things and I'm able to support healing in a way that I wouldn't be able to do if I was not. And so now I'm doing things such as therapy. Most of my clients are Black people, being able to have these honest, real talk conversations with my clients. I also have a coaching program for Black women who are ready to leave a toxic job. And just as I experienced, it's very scary to leave a toxic job. Very scary. No matter how much harm you're experiencing, sometimes you're crippled by the fear, right? Or you feel stuck by the fear. And so my coaching program is for Black women, again, who are ready to leave, right? And it's a way for Black women to, really confront what fears you have, to address the grief process that like I just talked about, also to develop an exit plan, right? Exit planning is very important. And then lastly, coming up with a wellness plan as you're going through the process, right? And so I feel like that's my giving back, is that I've made it through, I've made it out, and I want to help support other Black women making it out. And, I've always kind of felt a kinship or connection to Harriet Tubman. And even when I was at that job, I used to refer to myself as Harriet, right? Because I was advocating for Black people, right? In silence, but still advocating. And I used to say I was on the Underground Railroad trying to help Black people. And that's very problematic. The more I thought about it, so problematic to think that at a job that you have to be on the Underground Railroad to help Black people. Very problematic, right? But now I feel like I'm channeling Harriet in a better way, right? In a healthier way, in terms of helping Black women get out of these toxic work environments so they can live the fulfilling, abundant lives that they want to have, right? Just to think in terms of all that they've done to get to where they are. Many times Black women are just miserable in their work environments. And Brian, I don't know if you've already seen this, but it talks about, the research shows that Black women have higher rates of experiencing negative work environments. And Black women are now dying at earlier ages because of external issues such as racism, sexism, external factors, external issues such as a toxic job. And so I'm here to say, no, we deserve much better. And there's a way out, and I'm here to support you on that way out.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Actually, piggybacking off of that, I wanted to raise this stat with you because I've interviewed a few women after I saw an article about the Lean In Women in the Workplace report, right? And so, that report was about women as a whole, but then it kind of broke out into Black women, Asian women, Hispanic women, women with disabilities. Right. And so one of the stats that was interesting was it said that 1 in 3 Black women leaders says that they've been denied or passed over for opportunities because of personal characteristics, including race and gender.
Yep.
And so when I think about your job coaching program for specifically Black women, what are some of your thoughts now hearing that stat, right?
Yeah, it's not surprising, right? And I think that it's important because my program is a group coaching program. So it provides an opportunity for other Black women to validate one another. Because I think what happens in these workplaces is that you have this experience and you feel so alone. You feel like, am I the only one who's going through this? You wonder, who can you talk to in the work environment? And so when we have these experiences being passed over, it's good to have a community of people that you feel safe with, that you're able to talk about the common experiences, and also to provide you with the resources in terms of, okay, this happened to you. Let's think about ways to try to navigate the system if you want to stay there, right? Or let's start thinking about other possible options because you have dynamic skills to even be there, right? So what are some ways or what are some other opportunities that you can start exploring in terms of exit planning? So again, community is so important for Black women who are in those types of environments. So not only in terms of that validation, but also that support if either we decide to stay there or if we decide to move on. Now, I'm from the perspective of, I really don't know how you can heal an environment that's still harming you, right? So that's why my coaching program is for Black women who are ready to go, right? So it's different ways that we cope and we deal with situations, but how do we still rally around and support one another? because again, these experiences are not new for us. Unfortunately, a lot of the Black women that I interview on my YouTube channel, Brian, they have multiple, experiences of being in a toxic work environment, right? So when I ask them, can you tell me about a toxic work experience? They're like, which one? Right? Which one? There's so many of them,
Yeah.
right? And so my hope is that by having more conversations about this encourages other Black women to know you're not alone, that you know that there are options, that if you feel stuck, there are ways to get unstuck. My coaching program is one, option, but there's other ways to get unstuck. And there are other opportunities for you. Okay. And I don't want any Black woman to feel like she has to settle and really be in environments that are killing her.
Yeah.
No.
And, like similar to this mental health theme that I'm kind of having for this month and with our conversation, you'd mentioned something about things that like trigger trauma, right? And so would love for you to talk some to our listeners around what are some of the top signs that a job is really triggering trauma for individuals?
Yes. And again, that's individualized, but there's some common themes, right? So if you start noticing that you dread going to work, you literally dread. On your way to work or leaving work, you're crying. You are thinking about the job almost all the time. So even when you get home, you're still thinking about the job. Everybody that knows people at your job because you talk about it all the time. You are taking work home all the time. So you're working up and above the hours that you're supposed to be working, right? So there's no boundary for you and the job becomes all consuming. Okay. So those are some of the general ones, right? But then you could also be experiencing physical symptoms such as, difficulty sleeping, difficulties eating, overeating, not eating enough, sleeping too much, not sleeping enough, very anxious. So always feeling like you're on guard all the time. I remember I heard some Black women talking about like the thought of even sending an email, right, would raise so much anxiety because they're so concerned about what's going to happen when you're in the workplace, feeling that heightened level of you're being watched, right? Because many times you are being watched, right? And so that tone policing. So being so extremely mindful of how you say things, because as Black women, we're often criticized in terms of how we say things, right? Or how we might emote. And so that being something that you're always, really thinking about. Also, if you notice that because of your job, you're now distrustful of other people, like you don't trust anybody, or you might be very hypervigilant all the time. So you're always on guard. You're waiting for somebody to do something and you can't really relax. Okay. Now, on the other extreme, Brian, I've also heard of situations, and S. Anne Marie Archer talks about this with some of the clients that she works with. So she's an HR consultant. She's known as the anti-HR HR lady and an attorney, right? So she's talked about meeting with people who come to her and they are so broken that they're even thinking about suicide. Okay. So sometimes it could be that extreme. And again, I say to anyone, when you think about leaving a job, it's not easy to think about leaving a job, right? But when you recognize that a job is harming you significantly, right? You're having any of these things that I talked about, you're experiencing thoughts of hurting yourself, right? If it's that extreme, you need to take immediate action and get help immediately, okay? Because no job is worth our sanity or our health, okay? And so there's a range of different things like I talked about, but it could be that extreme, in terms of people having those thoughts. So we have to be very mindful of that.
No, without a doubt. And, one of the pieces of the show that I always like to provide to our listeners is really some advice from the guests that we bring on. And as I think about what we were just talking about with triggering trauma, for those who may be working at a job where they are experiencing this, and you've talked about, in your program, you're working with folks who are ready to leave.
Yeah.
So from an advice standpoint, how do you suggest that someone who may be experiencing these types of things on the job develop an exit plan?
Okay. I think before you develop an exit plan, you have to get some support, right? I think that it's important if you are in the situation, please seek therapy. Okay. I think you need a safe place to be able to talk and start the grieving process. Okay. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is if you have an opportunity to take a leave, I would definitely suggest that because again, it's hard to heal in that same environment that's harming you. So a leave allows you an opportunity to take a break and pause and allows you to have some level of clarity without having to fight that toxicity all the time. Okay. The other thing is that I would suggest, in therapy, start thinking about, well, what are your other possible options and start thinking about those options. So that's the part of the exit planning, right? Start thinking about your options and get a coach, right? So a coach can help you in terms of those next steps and really leading you in the right direction because sometimes we think we can do it ourselves, right? Not a good idea, right? Because there are certain things that we don't know, right? That a coach has that knowledge and the coach can support you and the coach can hold you accountable, right? So the coach is important in that regard. But also when you think about coaching, particularly group coaching, now you have a community of people who are there to support you and your growth. They're there to share other ideas with you. And so again, that helps you in terms of really recognizing your options. And Brian, what's so devastating a lot of times when you think about toxic jobs and leaving and people developing depression and suicidal thoughts is that there's this tunnel vision, like there's no way out, right? I have no other option, right? I have to no, we have to break out of that. That's part of the therapy. That's part of the coaching, right? That you start to see that there's other options and you get that support and you come up with a wellness plan for yourself to help sustain you and to help support your healing, right? So again, therapy, if you can take a break, take a leave, coaching or other types of mentorship that you can get in terms of exploring your options and start working on that exit plan. Okay. So again, and I want to say this, please show loving kindness to yourself because you are going through a trauma and you are healing from a trauma. So it takes a while for that to happen. So there are certain things that you might be able to do pretty easily and some things you may not, but be patient with yourself. And know that, again, unless it's an extreme situation where you're having thoughts of hurting yourself or other things that are more extreme, that needs to take immediate action. Leave. Please leave that job. Okay. If there's other things, it's kind of slow moving train, right? Like you see the signs, you're like, I'm not happy, I'm hurting, right? That's a process. So for me, it took more than 3 years for me to leave, right? And I started doing exit planning kind of small, right? But then 2020, boom, it's going in turbo mode, right? So get that support that you need to help you in that journey of healing and also pivoting into something that's more fulfilling for you.
No, I love that. And so, during Mental Health Awareness Month and BIPOC Mental Health Month, how can we help amplify the message about the resources that are available in this space?
Yes. Well, I think number one, it's important. And the one good thing that's come out of 2020 is that people are more aware about the importance of mental health, right?
Oh,
So
definitely.
everybody's talking about mental health, right? The stigma that we used to see a lot of mental health, particularly in the Black community, has really decreased a lot, right? So in terms of accessing services, I think it's important for us to continue that, right? To continue to talk about the importance of mental health. Just like we talk about physical health, we talk about diabetes and hypertension. We need to talk about mental health as well in terms of checking in with one another, checking in like, hey, how you doing, right? And being able to fully be able to tell certain people how we are really feeling. Many times we mask ourselves, right? Just think about the job. Sometimes we go into toxic jobs, we mask ourselves. So all day we're presenting that things are okay and we're dying inside, right? When can you take that mask off and really be yourself, right? Because we need to be able to be our full selves, right? So talking about mental health needs to happen. And also thinking about ways that just we generally seek support. So how can we talk about mental health more in our churches, our barbershops, our beauty salons, our nail salons, right? So the places that we may go, how are we normalizing mental health and mental health support? That's the one thing. The other thing is how do we make mental health services more affordable, right? So in terms of, increasing the access to mental health, how do we help increase that accessibility and affordability in terms of quality mental health services, right? So I don't want to just say any mental health services, because sometimes people go to mental health services and they can be harmed, okay? Because if you go to a therapist who is not competent, or a therapist who does not understand your culture, they can cause harm to you, okay? So as you are seeking out mental health support, you are interviewing that therapist, okay? And being okay with interviewing a therapist, because if you don't connect, you don't feel safe, you don't feel heard or understood by that therapist, you need to find another therapist, okay? Because that might cause you to drop out of treatment or not share things, and that harms you, okay? So that also in terms of, what types of activities are we doing to support community, a community healing, even thinking about what are other forms of healing that we may utilize that may not be therapy, but it supports our mental health, right? So like, are we having parties where you can actually dance, right? Are we having things that we support live music? Are we doing things that support our spiritual growth as well? So what are all the things and physical movement, right, is so healthy for us, particularly when we go outside, because we know that vitamin D is a natural mood elevator. What are we doing to incorporate within our lives on a daily basis, not just, 2 weeks for vacation, right? On a daily basis, how are we connecting with ourselves? Like, hey, how you doing today? Asking yourself, right? And doing what you need to do to help yourself feel better, but also are you connecting to and helping to support other people too? It's very important.
No, I love that. Well, look, Dr. Kimani, I just want to say thank you for taking some time to come on the show today. Your story, your practice, everything you're doing, I applaud you and just want to say keep it up. And would hope that we could also stay connected, but would love for you to share where our listeners can find you and support you and watch your show.
Yes, awesome. Yes. So I am on YouTube, Lifting as We Climb Consulting Wellness Services, where we focus on supporting individual and collective growth. It is a passion of mine to help support Black women leaving toxic jobs so they can live fulfilling, abundant lives. So my Black Women Healing from Toxic Jobs coaching program is available. So I have a group option, but I also have a one-to-one option. Sometimes people don't want to be in a group, right? Or they might want that more individualized attention. So that is an option as well. I also do trainings on issues such as suicide prevention. We didn't talk much about that, but I do trainings on suicide prevention in the Black community. So really looking at what are the issues that contribute to our functioning and ways that we can incorporate cultural issues in terms of prevention and intervention strategies. And, I'm very vocal about Black suicide for a number of reasons, right? As a mental health professional, as someone who lost, a father to suicide when I was a teenager. So I have a passion for that, okay? And when we think about suicide, many times people don't want to talk about it, right? It's very taboo. However, it's so important to talk about it because I don't know if you're aware, but the rates of Black youth suicide are increasing at a rate that we have never seen before. So again, we need to have these conversations. I also do trainings on things about, masking at your job and how to really identify other ways to address and navigate and, other issues in relation to trauma and mental health. I do provide therapy, also individual, family, and couples therapy. And I do have a book called Butterfly Landing. And the book is available on Amazon. The book talks about the healing journey of a Black girl who has survived or experienced sexual abuse. And again, the book is written from the perspective of a child because when you go through a trauma, many times your inner child is impacted, right? So the book connects to not only children, but also to adults. And that's written from the perspective of myself as a survivor, but also myself in terms of a licensed clinical psychologist. So again, that is available on Amazon as well. And my website is liftingupwithclimbconsulting.com.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I'll make sure I share all of that in the show notes. So look, that'll do it for today's episode. Again, I want to thank Dr. Kimani Norrington-Sands for joining me today. I hope you all have a great week, and we'll definitely see you next time. Thanks again, Dr. Kimani.
Thank you.
The Great Resignation, people leaving their jobs in droves. There's a lot of buzz happening in the job market of late. Now, did you or someone you know leave your job during the pandemic and want to share your story? We've been having some really good conversations in this space, so if you're interested, I'd love to have you join the program. If so, here's how you can do it. First, you can email us at hello@whyleft.co. That's hello@whyleft.co. Or visit us online at whyleft.co. That's whyleft.co. Look forward to having you join the conversation. Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyleft.co. That's whyleft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.